Hi, everyone. My name is Gina Petruccelli. I am the Solutions Director at 3Share. So I am really in charge of scoping, gathering requirements for new and existing clients, and laying out solutions in the AEM platform and across our projects on the Marketing Cloud. So I will be digging into how you define requirements successfully on an AEM project. So you'll want to start an AEM project day. Well, there's a few things we need to talk about to do that successfully. So we're going to dig into what are the common things you need to ask when you're scoping out a project, how you actually define those requirements successfully, what are the common pitfalls, and what are the impacts of those pitfalls, all the things everyone forgets to scope in a project, how you take all of those details and put it in a successful plan, and the key takeaways that you can have to put together a successful implementation. So when we're scoping across the Adobe Cloud, there are some common things that we are always looking at. For the most part, my presentation is going to focus on things that we're talking about when we're talking about scoping sites and assets. But obviously, more and more, we are adding target and analytics, in some cases campaign, to the bigger picture. So if you look across this, things like automation, data, how we pull that all together and report about it effectively are all things you need to consider when you're scoping a project, regardless of the tool that you're scoping it in. So if we start digging into scoping, these are some common topics and things that we like to focus on. I have quite a variety of questionnaires that I can run through when I'm scoping out a project. So one of the first things we want to look at is, what are the goals and challenges of the project? What is your business actually trying to accomplish with whatever we're building? If it's a site, are we trying to get a new audience? Are we redesigning because there's a new brand? What are we trying to do with this project? Are we trying to solve a specific problem? Do you have a site that exists today, but maybe the authors are really struggling to update their content? So we need to focus on the back end and how your authors actually manage that content and how they can do it more effectively. Or are you trying to gather more data about your audience so you can start to do segmentation? And is your analytics set up correctly? Are you new to AEM? Is this an upgrade? Or are we taking something that exists in the platform and adding to it? So those are all key questions, too, to consider when you're starting to look into your requirements. Then we start to dig into content. So what kind of content do you have? What are the types of assets? How many pages? Are we migrating from an existing platform? Or are we starting from scratch? Is this a new design? Is it a lift and shift? And how do we dig into that? Especially when we're talking new design. Is this new functionality that we're trying to drive? And do we understand what those requirements are with that new functionality? Or if we're lifting and shifting, are there things we need to consider? Like, we want to move to responsive, but we still want to keep the same look and feel that we have today. And how do we accommodate for that when we move into the platform? What's our migration strategy if we are moving content? So it's really key to dig into those type of questions. Permissions and workflows apply across the board no matter what. Do we need approvals? Who are your authors? Do they need a limited amount of experience in the platform? Do they need to be able to be a super admin and manage everything from tags down to metadata, down to the finer details of content approval? What should they be able to see and accomplish? And who needs to go through any workflow steps? If we're talking integrations, that's probably the key part of really digging into questions to make your project successful. Integrations are also where a big pit can open up for your client implementation team, and they can dive right in and drown because you didn't know or didn't ask the right questions up front. So from an analytics perspective, for example, are you using Google today? Do you have Adobe Analytics? Are you switching from one platform to another? Are you getting the right data that you need, and how are you integrating with those platforms? From a CRM perspective, what CRM are you integrating with? How are you sending the data? How is it being stored, and who's managing it? Are there APIs that exist for that platform, or do you need to build from scratch and consider that in your implementation? For e-commerce, same kind of questions. Is there an out-of-the-box connector in AEM you can use? Is this an in-house tool that you've custom built that you need to bring on your team who built that tool to integrate it in AEM? And then for translations, obviously, we're looking at not just languages, setting up master, country codes, regions, but also, are we integrating with the translation platform? Is there an out-of-the-box connector for AEM? Is that a seamless process? Do you have local editors who can manage the content once it comes back into the system? From an architecture perspective, especially when you're talking about someone like 3Share doing your implementation, we need to know about your hosting. Is it in-house? Are you on AMS? Are you using our ROM service? How are you hosting your platform and what is the setup? If it's new, are we discussing how you should set up your AEM environment in the first place before we even get started? Are we integrating with single sign-on, and is it on author and publish? Because there's a login on your website. How are we integrating? What system are we using? And who are the dependencies from your IT for something like that? Where are your authors and where are they located? How many do you have? Those are all things we need to consider when we're setting up architecture as well. And then how much data and content are we talking about? Especially when we're talking about an upgrade or we're starting from scratch and you're migrating content in, we need to consider that from an architecture perspective. And then something that sometimes we tend to forget from a project support perspective is who's actually responsible for everything that we're trying to do. It's never just your development team. It's never just IT. It's never just your content people. So how do you make sure you're aligning all the right responsibilities and who's going to do what? And then have you considered your training approach to ensure that as part of your scoping, that's all factored in, either from a documentation perspective, in training for user acceptance testing, all the way up to, hey, we've launched the site, and now my authors need to actually manage what we've built. So once we start asking those questions and gathering the answers, we actually need to start laying out our requirements. This is a really basic look at how we might lay out requirements for a website, right? We need to start looking at what kind of templates we're building. Are we using grid and responsive layouts that AEM has now in the latest versions? Are we needing to lock down what kind of components can be used on each template, or are we allowing a lot more flexibility for our authors? Because that can change how many templates we're building on a project. Then we need to start breaking up the components and the configurations. Again, how are we integrating analytics? Do we have multiple layers of navigation? Where is our search and how is it integrated into the site? Things like hero banners, rich text editors. Are we using some of the common core components in AEM and building upon them? Are we building new things from scratch? Do we have things existing that we can take advantage of? And then once we start to lay those out into more of a list format, we also need to start to consider how they need to be done. Are there any dependencies? For example, if we're building workflows from scratch and we're new to the AEM environment and I want my notifications outside of AEM, I require SMTP before I can actually test that functionality and fully build my workflow. So also considering your dependencies. If we have an API that we have to write from scratch, who's actually writing it? How are we testing it? When does that need to be done so we can test out that integration and pull in the data that we need? Once I started to lay out the requirements, I like to obviously we need to start looking at level of effort. So I always build in a spreadsheet because then I can put in comments and things about components. This is really important because at the end of the day, what we're scoping is being handed off to an implementation team. So while I'm in my little silo asking all the right questions and gathering all the data, I'm at the end of the day not building everything. So how am I going to properly hand this off to a team? The more notes and the more information I can gather, the more effective the team on the ground is going to be when the scope of work gets handed off to start a project. So those things can be anything from, are we using a flexible grid? Are there set components in these templates? What's our search logic? Are we integrating with a third-party tool like Solar? And has that already been set up and considered? What can an author do with that hero banner? Are there buttons? Are there different colors and functionality from a style perspective that they can change, or are we locking it down to base level fields? Are we using out of the box and common components? Are we building something new? Can we take advantage of the out-of-the-box approval workflow? Are there custom steps we need? Where do notifications need to go out, and how is that managed? For tagging and taxonomy, does it exist today? Are we building from scratch? Are we migrating what exists? Are we improving what's there? And are we automating anything? So when I build a page, is some of that metadata and tagging information getting automatically applied because I've done the right thing with the structure of my website to make that more effective for my authors? Where is my metadata being managed by my authors, and what are the key things we require them to fill out? Are there data integrations? Is it a custom API? Is it a connection? How is the data supposed to be stored and where? So those are all things to take into consideration when you're starting to scope, because again, the more information I can provide, the better the team on the ground is going to be. I often like to do a low and high level of effort, especially if requirements are a little unclear, which we'll talk about in a bit. And then I can take the median and apply that to a formula, which I'll show you guys at the end, how all this data and all these numbers come together. One thing I like to consider too is as you're doing projects again and again and again, especially if you're familiar with the AEM environment already, is talking about how we can reuse what exists. Creating a common library is a great way to do this because you can have the same authoring dialogues, apply different styles across your sites. It alleviates a lot of the training you need to do long term, and it just creates a seamless approach. Can you recycle what's already there? So maybe you have a carousel that exists, but there's new business requirements. Can you take that as a baseline and build upon it so that you're saving a level of effort? And have you taken that into consideration when you're scoping out the number of hours something might take? And then after a project is complete, how do you learn and improve? So understanding your team's velocity. Is what you scoped actually align with how your team was able to deliver? Are the hours that you estimated accurate or not? What were the pitfalls there? If it took this much time to accomplish a certain task, you can assume that it might take a similar amount of time the next time around or a little less. So are you factoring that in when you scope out your work? Another thing you have to track is common pitfalls. So these are some of the things that I run into that always make scoping a little more difficult. Unclear requirements are always hard. Sometimes the business doesn't even know what they want. I like to use the analogy that it's like going into an ice cream store with 25 flavors and your friend asks you what they should eat. It's really hard to decide what someone else should eat when it comes to ice cream flavors. They might not like the same things as you. But sometimes that's what we have to do when we're trying to line up business requirements, especially if there's a deadline. Incomplete design also makes things tricky. So if you're starting a new design from scratch, but it's not all done, how are we clear that all that functionality is actually properly scoped? There are obviously questions we can ask about what the goals are, but ultimately there's always going to maybe be something that's a slight disconnect if we can't see a full design before we start an implementation. So factoring that in from a scope of effort of leaving some breathing room, knowing there could be changes or additional scope is important when you're looking at that. There's always last-minute additions, so how do you deal with that, or changes to scope? Looking at your dependencies. This is a big one because when you have multiple teams, especially when you're working maybe with multiple integration partners, or you're trying to integrate new systems, or you're trying to bring teams together that maybe don't work together every day, have you actually factored in what that communication time looks like versus the actual implementation of the work that you're doing? And then we always have to go back to roles and responsibilities, which is part of the dependencies. Who's actually doing what and when? And have you aligned those dates with everyone in the room? Looking at mitigation and impact, the things that we always throw back are the 3 basic things that you can always do when you're looking to mitigate some of those common pitfalls. First thing's easy. You can swap scope. I have a component. I want this new component instead. If the level of effort is pretty similar, then we can just swap like for like. We can deprioritize some items, trade up for similar, keep the same timeline and budget. Business is usually pretty happy with that. If all the new changes and new requirements are absolutely a hard, I have to add these, this is important, I can't go live without this. Unfortunately, it means more time, more money, or both. So how does that align with the business? And then you can always descope. So one of the things I always look at, especially when we're talking a large implementation, is can we actually narrow this down into an MVP and do a phased approach rather than trying to build the rocket ship right away? Let's build the foundation first and then work our way up. So this means really considering, hey, we can descope these items, but still meet the business deadline and ensure a solid delivery because we've got a phased plan. It could mean that we keep the same timeline and same budget, or we can reduce timeline and budget to get the things out the door that are the most important and then move on to phase 2. Assumptions are key also to make sure that everyone is aligned with what you're trying to do and what things we need to assume are X or Y. These are some common assumptions we put on projects. So one, just right off the gate, we don't recommend customizing the AEM authoring environment. So if you don't like the way Adobe has made the authoring environment look and feel and you want to brand it and change the colors and change where everything is, we really recommend limiting that. So this is a common assumption that we like to make because it's going to make upgrades more painful. And at the end of the day, you bought the tool and this is what your authors need to use. What browsers do you need to align with? Obviously, this changes depending on everyone's QA line, but considering that so that you're not trying to use some outdated browser, or we've had projects where the CEO has a really old phone, they don't want to upgrade it. Platform's got to work for them because they want to see the big picture at the end of the day. So are you taking those things into consideration? Who's the subject matter experts, especially the when we're talking about non-AEM technologies, like an in-house tool that we're going to integrate with? Do we have the right people who can actually explain to us how the system works and the best way to integrate it with? Who's responsible for UAT, QA testing, and have you aligned those expectations? Who's responsible for migration and content entry at the end of the day? Especially if we're talking about a site. It's great if we have all these templates and components, but if the content's not there when you launch at the end of the day, it's not going to be the full big picture that everyone's expecting. Again, if designs are still up in the air, we know that if designs change, they could have an impact. Is everyone in the business clear that if we are in the middle of development and designs are still in progress, that can have an impact ultimately on the timeline and the delivery? And how are integrations working? Are there existing APIs? Have we factored in if we need to build from scratch? These are just some common assumptions that we use. Obviously, every project is unique and we have to consider them. But making sure that everyone's clear what the assumptions are and why they are there makes projects much more effective. So we've done all the nitty-gritty of components and templates and all the things that are going to make your AEM environment work. But there's more to a project than just code. So these are all the things that I find that everyone forgets to factor in when we're talking about scope. What about all the documentation at the end of the day? So we've built this great website. Who knows what we built and how they're supposed to manage it? Have we factored in the time to properly test what we're building and make sure everyone's requirements are met? Is there time for our technical architects to do code review to ensure we're aligning with best practice when we actually deploy between our environments? And what about all the meetings? This is a big one because we like to talk a lot about our projects, but we still need time to actually do them. So have we factored in the time to have those conversations about how to solution? So talking about documentation, these are some key ones that from 3Share we always do on a project, and we need to make sure our team has time to do them. So if you're on Adobe Managed Services, the Adobe Runbook, especially if you're new to AEM, is one of the requirements. Or have we factored in the time to update your existing Runbook? Have we allowed time for a user guide? So not only are we going to train people over the phone or in person, but what happens when we leave? Do they have the proper documentation of how to use all these great components so their authors can manage the content? And have we allowed time for that document to be built? And then we obviously want our technical architect and our developers to also build out a technical design document. Because what about all those great integrations? What about the workflows? How have we actually configured the environments? Because when you go to upgrade, all the things that we've configured in the environment are key for those next steps. So do your admins have what they need from whoever your implementation partner is and what they've built? Code reviews. I always need to allow time for my technical architects to do code reviews because we like to follow certain best practices about our code. This doesn't take a ton of time, but it means that every single task a developer is doing needs to be routed to someone, and they need time to look at it and either say, nope, fix this, or yes, it's great, and I'm going to pull it into the branch. So have we allowed time for that process, whatever it is that you're aligning? From a testing perspective, what are our testing requirements? Obviously, not every project necessarily has every single one of these test criteria, but what if it did? Have you actually allowed time for all of this to happen? When does it need to happen? We've often dealt with, from a best practice perspective, some testing requirements needing to be done before I can move from dev to stage and stage to production and ultimately launch my website. So am I testing across all the environments? Am I only required to test on production? Do some of those tests need to be vetted by IT or a QA group before we can move forward? So making sure you factor that into your timeline and are following whatever your best practice protocols is key. And lastly, meetings. Maybe not everyone on the team needs to be in every single one of these discussions, but some of your team probably does. So daily stand-up calls, 15 to 30 minutes, but every day. Weekly status meetings. Are you requiring your whole team to participate, or is it just your team leads? Who's part of grooming and grooming sessions? Are you allowing the business stakeholders to be part of that process? Is it internal only? Do you have both? Are you allowing time to practice for demonstrations before you show the business what you've been producing, and then making sure to allow time for those demos and a discussion for back and forth? As you decide you want to add or change requirements, are you allowing time for that new solutioning? And then for testing and handoffs, are your developers actually handing off the information needed for your QA analyst to properly test what they've done? When the business is ready to do user acceptance testing, do they understand what they need to test, how they get into the environment, where they need to go? Making sure that your team has time to accomplish that is key. So if we take all of that together, we need to develop the right formula. So typically, I am laying out on an Excel sheet all of the resources that I need for a project, what hours they're working every week, how many sprints does that align with, based on the complexity of the project, how much time do I need for user acceptance testing? Am I launching one site? Am I launching multiple sites? Are there key integrations that we need to turn on and off? How much time do I need for launch? From a post-launch support perspective, do I have the right people on the ground to make sure that as I'm handing off the responsibilities of whatever I built to the next team, do we have time for that handoff? Is everybody properly trained? Is the documentation signed off at the end of the day? How does that add up from a cost perspective based on whatever rates from an implementation perspective? Or if you're just trying to track hours, how does that factor in? One of the key parts that I like to look at from a formula perspective is you can see down at the bottom, I have total development hours. That development hours is only across the sprints. It doesn't include discovery, it doesn't include UAT, launch, or post-launch. What is the pure development time we have factored in from a timeline perspective for our architect and development resources? Have I allowed time for TA oversight? Based on the complexity of the project, do they need 25%? Do they need 50%? Do they need to be 100% dedicated to solutioning and code reviews and designing what we're building? So factoring in how much time your architect needs based on your project is key. What is, when we start to lay out all those requirements, estimate the hours, what's the median development hours that I've estimated? And does that total development hours map up? And then is there any difference? So if I take my total development hours minus TA oversight, minus my estimations, am I left with 0? Am I in the negative? Or do I have a little bit of breathing room? And do I need the breathing room, or does it mean I can save hours and effort? Those are some of the things I like to look at, and that's how we put together a basic scope of work. Once you have that scope of work, you obviously need to start aligning then what that means across that timeline. So we have the hours, we have our budget, we know what resources we need. But what are we actually going to accomplish? Because the business at the end of the day wants to know how long it's going to take, what it's going to cost, and what are we going to do. So lining up those milestones, even down to what you think you're going to accomplish in each sprint. This is key when we're talking about dependencies, like I said, because some of the work you're doing, you may need to do across multiple sprints. So if you factor in enough time to accomplish that over multiple weeks. And then we get into that MVP versus post-MVP, or what a full project timeline versus an MVP timeline. So if we're looking at a full Big Bang project, and we've laid it all out, and the business says, that's great, but I want to get it done in December, and you have a project that wouldn't end until February, how can you accommodate that? At some point, adding more bodies doesn't really add up. So is there a way to look at a more MVP approach? Are there business requirements that don't have to be there in order to meet that business deadline? Sometimes showing the timelines of, we think these are the most important things to be successful, versus this was what the full project would take and the impacts and the dependencies and the risks, the business is often willing to say, great, let's build that foundation and go from there. Lastly, at the end of the day, when I'm done scoping, I have to hand this off to a team. So often what that process looks like is I'm reviewing the scoping document that I put together, sharing all those notes, any documentation from design, anything that I've collected that can help them be successful. And I'm also confirming those assumptions and dependencies that I know so that when they walk in the door on day one, they know what they need to get started. And then from a post perspective, something that we're working on is we did this project. I estimated it took 12 weeks. It's done. Did it actually take 12 weeks? If not, why? Maybe we added scope. Maybe we added something else. What was that impact? Did the scope actually map up like we expected, or were the business requirements totally off? And where did we miss? And how do we improve that for the next time? So to me, the key takeaways when you're looking at scoping is, can you pick a flavor right off the bat? Do you know what you want? And if not, who does? And can we get them in the room to make those decisions? Are we asking the right questions so that we can define our requirements successfully? For anything where we can't define those requirements correctly, do we understand what the impact is when we start the project? Do we have what we need to create the right plan so we have the right resources, a clear timeline, and when we're going to launch at the end of the day? And then putting that all together to hand it off successfully to our team.